share with you our panelists. First, we have Dr. Seth Basuma. He's a distinguished teaching professor of Africana Studies and Political Science. He's a department chair of Africana Studies, and of course, right here at SUNY Portland. We also have joining us tonight Mr. Dominic Carter, class of 1985. He's a WABC radio and longtime TV political anchor. Thanks so much for being with us. We also have Dr. Rachel Forrester, two-time grad, class of 12 and master's degree 14. She's the Associate Director of the Office of Identity, Equity, and Engagement at UNC Charlotte, and she's the founder of RF Equity Consulting. Thank you, Rachel. We also have Mrs. Regina Grantham, also another SUNY Portland professor. She's the Associate Professor of Communication Disorders and Sciences, and she's a fellow at the American Speech Language and Hearing Association. Thanks, Regina. And last but not least, Mr. Yusuf Mohammed, another double grad, 99, and master's in 01. He's the principal of Purpose-Built Schools Atlanta, which is a STEAM academy. So I thank you all so much for joining us. Just to give you an idea for the folks participating what this night will be like, you might have a better viewing experience if you scroll up and either pick the focus or the stage view. Then the panelists will pop up in your view as they speak. We kind of describe this as a fishbowl tonight. So you're looking in and viewing these folks talk about their experiences and the reality of two Americas. We do heavily encourage conversations within the chat room, so please do have discussions amongst yourselves. And if we see something really kind of resonating amongst the group of you, I may shoot a message to the panelists to see if they wish to discuss it at their table. So without further ado, sorry, I'm just looking one more thing. We will be live streaming tonight as well in Facebook. I'm going to ask our panelists to talk about the first question, which is tonight's event is titled Racism, White Supremacy, and the Reality of Two Americas. Do you believe there are two Americas, and what have been your experience with it? Dominic, Rachel, Regina, Seth, or Yusuf, please feel free to jump in and start the conversation.
I mute periodically because there's a little bit of background noise here, so.
No worries. If you have to pause to unmute, we understand.
So you want us to answer the question. Are there two Americas?
Yes.
And my answer is yes. One of power, not of power. I think this was Two Americas was first coined, I believe, by Martin Luther King in the 60s, where he talked about one America was very beautiful, another was pretty ugly. And I equated in my terms of looking at the beautiful America as being one that has white privilege, white supremacy, all wonderful things. Being white allows them to have everything, whereas the other America for me is something that Martin Luther King said was ugly. It was denying others of their rights. And I equated that to those of us who have no power to start the conversation.
I'm happy to jump in as well. Regina, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And we had the opportunity as panelists to engage in conversations with each other before this event started as well, and we had a really fruitful conversation. And while I believe that the reality is two different experiences within in America. I believe that there's one America and that the power and the privilege is what causes and impacts oppression to exist. And so for me, one wouldn't exist without the other. And so I think by confronting the reality of white supremacy in our country and confronting the fact that there are powerful systems of dominance that then create experiences of disadvantage, experiences of oppression, that it's important to name that that is a direct correlation and a direct cause for me. And so I think we're saying the same thing. I think that I view it differently. I'm viewing it from the lens of like, this has caused this, and we need to really confront the reality of that. And by dividing the two things, I think that we are not taking responsibility for the ways that particularly white people need to confront the ways that we have perpetuated, maintained, and benefited from these systems of power and dominance.
Yep. And I'd say, one, it's an honor to be here. I'm excited to be here. And I just want to say hello to my classmates at Cortland, Josie Maldonado, and of course, Titi Leo, and Dr. Sam Kelly, who I see is here, who I love and I miss, who really took care of me when I was a student at Cortland. So Dr. Kelly, I appreciate you. And I'm going to come and see you, Dr. Kelly. But of course, there's two Americas. I mean, I think I noticed it earlier as a young man. There was a show called Silver Spoons that was on television, and I couldn't understand how this kid lived in this mansion with this train riding around in his home. And from that point forward, I knew that my life was different and there was an other. And it became exacerbated when I entered SUNY Cortland in 1995. And that I can go on and on about some of the events that happened on campus that helped me realize that the way I grew up wasn't necessarily the way others grew up, and that my life chances was indeed compromised by my phenotype, by my skin color. So indeed, two Americas, in theory, we exist in America, but through class, through race, through many divisions, people have different experiences.
Yeah, I think I'll take it from here. And as Yusuf Muhammad did, Yusuf was my advisee very, very long ago. And Dr. Kelly is also here. I'd like to thank Erin for putting us together. I see many of my students here, and I'm still in Cortland, and many that I don't know. But this is a very, very important gathering. So I am happy to be on the stage with some of my students and some of those that I don't know. But this is a very, very powerful question, especially 2020, 2021. We see America is more divided than ever. And that is, unfortunately, at the genesis, at the building of this country, it was supposed to be a complex idea by the founding fathers. And it still remains a complex idea of what this country can be. Langston Hughes once told us, let America be America again. He was questioning in 1938 the two Americas. This complexity of America is America of democracy, but America that has an irony also of democracy. America, one with citizenship, and America of the others that are still struggling to define their citizenship. America that looks at individualism for one group, and America that interrogates group structures for another group. So when you look at all these things, you can travel as far back as history. There were two Americas. One America that came in merchant ships, and other America that came in slavery. One America that owns the land, and another America that works the land. There has always been two Americas, and our job is to bring two Americas together. And it has been a struggle. Yes, there are two Americas.
So I guess I'll step up at this point. I want to say hello to everyone. I want to say hello to Professor Sam Kelly, who when I was a struggling EOP student and had absolutely nothing and did not know how to communicate, it was Dr. Kelly that helped make me into the journalist that I am today. Aaron, can you hear me, folks? Can you hear me? Okay. So I want to say thank you, Aaron, for putting this together. I want to say thank you to Flossie Lomax, also to Yvette Parrish, who she and I were in the same class at Cortland. To ask the question if there are two Americas, that's not even a question. There's definitely two Americas. There is definitely. And I can talk from the perspective of a journalist who's covered many of the issues that we will talk about on the front line. I've covered the court system on the front line. There's definitely two systems of justice. I've covered some of the most high-profile police brutality cases, alleged police brutality cases in the world. There's definitely separate ways of policing. And so you have to understand, when I came to Cortland, Aaron, I was a kid from the projects out of the Bronx, out of the Throgs Neck houses. And within a couple of short years, I went from poverty and food stamps to an education. And by the way, I do want to say this. I had a wonderful time at Cortland. There was only one time at Cortland when I was reminded of my race. I was a DJ struggling to make it, and I would work at some of the local bars. And at 2 a.m. in the morning, I was walking home one night, and some kids in a 4x4 yelled the N word, and they didn't say N, they said the actual word. That was the only bad experience that I had at Cortland. For me, the institutional racism started once I got to graduate school at Syracuse University, not far from Cortland. And so we're talking about, are there two Americas? When I got to graduate school, the president of Cortland at the time was James Clark. I had a letter of recommendation from President Clark. I had a solid GPA, and I was denied admission into the Syracuse Newhouse School on 3 separate occasions. And once I brought up the topic of race, and there were no students that looked like me in the class that I went in. So I went from welfare and poverty to a college education and quickly into a world of enormous power. So I graduated in 85. By 88, I'm covering the presidential campaign, assigned full-time to the Reverend Jesse Jackson, traveling with him. And so I say there are two Americas based on conversations I've had with Reverend Jackson. I say that there are two Americas based on conversations that I've had directly with Nelson Mandela. I had the opportunity to interview Mr. Mandela. So I'm not going to monopolize the time. We're going to talk about all of these things. But to question if there are two Americas is missing the point. Mostly right now I'm preaching to the choir because you're all good folks. And you want the world, you want one America and for things to be better. But we're certainly living in a world where there are two Americas. There's no doubt about it. Whites have one system where they're treated with privilege. African Americans have another where you don't have the privilege.
And since we're having a conversation, I just like to add one more thing before the next question. One book that came out long ago by Chris Hayes called A Colony in a Nation is something we all have to touch base with. And it talks about the two Americas that we are talking about, two distinct entities of America, one for white and the other for minoritized groups. Chris Hayes talks about a nation that has a criminal justice system for protection and a colony that has a criminal justice system that people run away from. and he goes around the book in talking about the differences between a colony, Black America, and a nation, United States of America.
I don't have any disagreement with what you said, Seth. I'm in total agreement. As a matter of fact, my years are just a little bit longer than yours, and I go way back to when I was a kid, and my father was a correctional officer. And talking about two worlds, he brought home Black men who were unjustly incarcerated, truly, some really ridiculous. And that's when I first learned about two worlds, really. Very, very amazing, and to look at all that we have gone through from just when, I'm not giving you a year, but way back then, compared to where we are now. We still have two Americas. And sometimes that's very discouraging to me because I look at, I don't remember who sings that song, but it's like one step forward and two steps back.
It's been quiet. I'm going to add one more thing because this is what I do. I talk for a living. Yesterday, I had a presentation, and my presentation was about anti-racism and all the things that we have to do to have an anti-racist America. But we have to do it with caution, because there are so many other things. And I brought up a personal example of the America that I thought I was in, trying to buy a land. Everybody mentioned Dr. Kelly for a long time, and so I will mention that too. When I started in Cortland, I lived with Dr. Kelly. And when I was ready, and Yusuf left with us too. We stayed together. Our good students, we always invited them to live with the professors. And
I was there.
live with us. And that was beautiful, right? Living with your students, helping them out and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But later on, I found out that I got to build my own home. So I left Dr. Kelly, and in the process of buying the land to build my own house, I really saw the two Americas. I have America that respects green dollars. My $35,000 that I have, the landlord will not give me the land, even though it has a for sale sign on top of the land. He will not take $35,000 from a Black man. And so I have to live with my money. But what did I do? I had a friend who lives in the other America, a white woman, who took the money and went the following day to say, I want to purchase that land. And the land was sold to the white woman. It was only at the closing that the landowner and I met face to face. Of course, he passed out. But the two Americas coming together was in the office of the lawyers, and it was not a pretty scene. And at that point, I know I was across the other boundary. I got the land, but it was a struggle. And guess who got the land for me? It was a white woman who lives in the other America who was able to purchase the land, not me. I'm Black. The landowner was white. The dollar bills were green, and they are still green, but he would not take money from a black man, only from a white woman, to Americas. And that was very painful, very, very painful. Anytime I leave my property today, I think about that episode. It traumatized me for a very, very long time. And my house becomes a reminder of what America is all about.
And so, Aaron, when I think of Two Americas again, if I go back to education, Dominic, I'm also an EOP student, and if Keith Smith did not accept me into the EOP program in the summer of 1995, I don't know what would have become of me. And so many of my friends I went to high school with, just because of their life circumstances, their race and poverty, they didn't have the opportunity to get into school and really not only change the life trajectory for themselves, but for their families and future generations. So just based on how you look, communities you come from, in poverty, it can really change your life and the life of generations ahead of you. And it should not be like that in a place that's a so-called, democracy. So I've learned early on that that we do not live in a meritocracy, right? You do not grow or you do not excel based on necessarily merit. It has a lot of other things to do with it. And if education is the so-called great equalizer, not enough people have access to a quality education or opportunities to take them to that space of economic freedom or sustainability in this world as it exists.
I just want to say this. The professor, the chair of the department, said a second ago that when discussing race, we have to be careful. And he's dead on, because, Aaron, this is so odd for me to discuss publicly race. For 35 years in journalism, from radio, television in New York City, to all the national shows, Face the Nation, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News channels. For 35 years, I've been told, don't talk about race, right? You look at me and you see a black man. And I said a second ago that all that here in this forum are good people. It's my understanding that Jack Carr is part of this conversation. Jack Carr is one of the people that when I came out of the projects from welfare, food stamps, and came to Cortland, he was one of my professors, and in terms of the Summer Institute, and was there for me the entire time to get me through. So there are good people in the world, and I don't want to come off as everything in terms of race. But every black person in this conversation, person of color, African American, could give you a story, many stories of how we've been slighted, denied fair treatment. The professor mentioned his mortgage, right? I had the same situation in South Africa. We went to South Africa and was going to rent a villa to stay at. The person said it was available. We got there, said we're going to get the money and come right back. And all of a sudden on the phone, 15 minutes later, it wasn't available. Now, this was South Africa, but race is an issue. To say that race is not an issue, you're in denial. And in fact, I think that race, it's not going to be solved in our lifetime. If we're going to be honest, let's be honest about it. And so, this is very weird for me, because I'm allowed to talk about many things, but often when I talk about them, a PR department has approved what I'm going to say, what I'm not going to say. And for 35 years, I've been told, avoid race. High profile black man on television and radio, and I've been told, avoid race. So to sit here and listen to this conversation, it's eye-opening to me, because I know what exists out there, but I was told, don't do it. It won't help your career, Mr. Carter. Don't do it.
I will say there has been some improvement in the way people interact with those of us who are quote unquote people of color, because when I went to school, there was no EOP. When I went to school, you were told You can't go to Penn State. You can't do anything but go to a historically Black school. And I am as ornery as they come. Tell me no, I will go do it. So that was another, I couldn't understand. What do you mean I can't go here or I can't go there? This isn't America. Again, that was an opportunity to see there were two Americas, but we have changed a lot. Listening to listening to Yusuf, and of course I know Jack Carr, and all the efforts that are made to try and make things slightly better. But when I came along, that didn't exist. Not only that, when I got to Penn State, big deal, really gone to Penn State, and quota system way back then, and door slammed in your face because you're Black and you people flunk out anyway, and I won't waste my time. And I surely wish I had seen that gentleman who was supposed to be my advisor so I could say, guess what? I'm teaching at college, and would have, I used to be a department chair. I did a lot of things this person that you said would flunk out. So I give credit to EOP.
We said, I'm back again.
What?
Unless you have a next question. Mr. Carter has a good point. They say don't talk about race. But I read, I research, and I write about race. So I have to talk about race. I am on a target list somewhere in Cornell that I teach about race in Cortland. Again, yesterday I was telling my audience that there's a professor, Jacobson, who have created a list of those who teach courses like I do, and we are being targeted. Now our occupation is almost with hazard. But yes, I was in Russia as a kid. Race was an issue. For them, they've never seen Black people that much at the time that I was in Russia. I've been in about 75 different countries doing my thing.
Clayton and Zachary.
Yes, and race is always an issue. A book I use in my Race and Politics in America starts by saying race is a major category in American life. We cannot avoid it. We have to face it. It was constructed. We have to deconstruct it for us to make sense. And that is why we are here. Let's talk about race.
Dr. Azuma, I really appreciate that, and all the folks that have commented as well. Like, I think one of the things that's really evident is how this impacts every single system. Like, it's not just as simple as, are there two Americas? It's what are the experiences in every single system that's controlled by white supremacy and whiteness. And so even the conversation around, well, we shouldn't talk about race. Like, who does that provide comfort to? What does that maintain? And how is that just very strategic to keep the world the way that it is? And so even talking about race is an act of resistance. And I think it threatens people and it challenges people, because I know that I lived my life, I'm a white person. I lived my life not having to think about my race. I tell people all the time that I knew that I was queer before I knew I was white. And I have been white my entire life. And so what are the ways specifically that white people also need to talk about race, but from the viewpoint of what does it mean to be white, and what are the ways that we perpetuate harm? Because even in my family, when we talked about racism, or when we talked about race, it was always about people of color. And it was from a very deficit perspective, and it wasn't intentional. It was just how we were socialized. And so how can we flip that script to talk about what are the ways that I actually cause the experiences that all of the panelists on here are the panelists of color, the Black panelists, the multiracial panelists are experiencing because of the fact that I have not had to confront the ways that I am complicit in the system and benefit in the system. And so I appreciate you all sharing just authentically about your experiences, and also challenge all the white folks like me on the call to think about the ways that we create this system and maintain this system and the harm that it does to folks of color.
I remember my freshman year at Cortland was the first time I heard the term white privilege. And I took a course, Intro to African American Studies, and we read the article by Peggy McIntosh about unpacking the invisible knapsack. And that was back in 1995. So fast forward, 2020 was really an incredible year for the discussions around race and white privilege. And it made many people around the country very uncomfortable. I got a chance to see my 12-year-old and 16-year-old daughters really witness and sort of, see what was happening in the world and hear them respond. When I was 18 and I lived in Alger Hall on campus during the fall of 1995, I was the only Black person on my floor. And I walked into my bathroom one day and someone drew a picture of me being hung from a tree. And they wrote, "Kill non-white person," under that picture. And so I don't know if some of the professors remember that time period. I called my mother and she said, "Yusef, come home. Come to Bed-Stuy. You got to come home." I said, "No." And I went to the cafeteria, went to a hall, and I noticed something that I didn't pay attention to until that very moment. All the Black students were sitting together at the same table, in the hall, in the dining hall. And I sat and told the group what happened, and it led to a series of events on campus. And it was a really, really tough time. But thinking about 1995 and 2020, I think this is an opportunity to let the conversations resurface, because this is about lives, right? This is about life chances. And when you think of the prison population and the disproportionate amount of Black men and Latino men in prisons, race in this discussion has a real impact on the life chances of so many people. It's not just a conversation. This is about life and death.
Absolutely. And Yusuf, I think I got a text saying that we had a question in the chat that I wanted to pose, and I think that it segues very well. So how do two Americas play out on college campuses? Is a question from someone on the call.
I know when I was in Cortland, it's weird to think of a college campus these days with technology and laptops, and I don't know how people do it, right? But I just remember being really close to my African-American professors and leaning towards them. I remember Dr. Kelly was the first person to put on a blazer for me and taught me how to tie a tie because I didn't know what to do, and then I would just lean on my students a lot. But we also had white allies, who were unafraid to speak up and to speak out. And at the other end, we had some classes where it was very tense, and white students just did not understand what in the world we were talking about because they were from Groton or Dryden and it just did not have the experience with any other group of people. So it was very stark. I remember I was on campus during the O.J. Simpson trial. And I walked into Alger Hall and we had one television in the lounge. And I will never forget when the verdict was read. I yelled and jumped and screamed, and everybody, they looked at me like I was a madman. They were so upset. 1995 was a year. It was a year. So very tense back then.
I just noticed that Flossie Lomax posted a comment that said that Cortland is ahead of the curve in terms of a good thing when it comes to race, the state university. I agree with that. Is everything perfect at Cortland? Absolutely not. When I was there from 82 to 85, basically the Black kids hung out with the Black kids, the white kids hung out with the white kids. But even in my case, that was a little different because a few of the white kids hung out with me. But again, it was only once I got to Syracuse. So I didn't really realize the problem of race until I got to Syracuse in grad school. And that's when I had a professor who's still alive, so I won't say his name. He said to me with a straight face, he said, Dominic, you can't be a newscaster. You don't even talk white. I'll take that to my grave. I turned in a paper as a graduate student 15 minutes late, and he gave me a C. And as we all know, a C on the graduate school level is tantamount to almost a D, close to an F. And again, when I was at the Newhouse School, and you know, we all know that Syracuse is very close to Cortland, but Newhouse is known for making some of the best journalists in the world. And how dare I think that I could fit in with that? But I did think I could fit in, and once I finally got in, I excelled. But it was an experience at Syracuse that taught me straight up that I was a black man and that I would be treated differently. What Cortland and Syracuse did do for me, there were times in my career where, I'm going to be honest with you folks, where I wanted to cry, because I would walk into City Hall at New York City, right, covering the mayor of New York. You know, you've made it, these most powerful officials, and I would be the only black one in the room, covering Koch, Giuliani, Dinkins, Bloomberg, on and on and on. I'd be the only black person. And that's not a good feeling. That's not a good feeling at all. So we can talk over and over and over all night long about there are two Americas, but then also in my world, we also have to deal with the other fact that sometimes we don't exactly help ourselves. And I'm talking about people of color. And so covering law enforcement and so on, what they say to me all the time, I'm talking about the feds, the Southern District of New York, the NYPD, they will say to me, Dominic, crime in the black community. All the suspects are black. And so, you know, and of course we have to look at the proportion of the population. But when you take on race, it's just a topic that, and I'm sitting here in amazement because I can be free. Normally, I have to go to a PR department and they have to approve every word that I'm going to say. And now I can sit here and talk freely about race. It took 40 years into my career, but I can finally be free. And it's a good thing to be free and be able to articulate, because I've witnessed some foul things of what happened to people of color. Court system, cops, Eleanor Bumpers, Yusef Hawkins. I can give you a list, Eric Garner. I can go on and on and on. I don't want to monopolize the time, but the issue is real. Banking, what about that? Mortgages, loans, what about that? What about that? And are there two Americas? I mean, no offense, Aaron, you're not going to be treated the same way at a bank as I am. If I go apply for a $750,000 loan, they're going to look at me and say, what is this drug dealer doing here? Or somehow this guy is scamming. And that's the world. But I do think people like Sam Kelly and Jack Carr, because without both of them, I would not be here today. I stand on the shoulders of Sam Kelly and Jack Carr. Jack Carr was literally my professor. And when I'm going to be straight here, what 80% of the kids, EOP kids, failed English. Jack Carr prepared us and got us ready, where one of the things I'm most proud of all these years later is I passed English 101 at Cortland my first time around. I got, I think, a D, but I made it past the class. And so now it's about opening the door for everyone, but in particular for kids of color that are coming behind us in our respective fields.
I appreciate those sentiments, and one of the things that I'm reflecting on is the statement around like Cortland as an institution is ahead of the curve on race relations and education. And while I think it's really great to call attention to all of the positive things that are happening within universities, I also think that that could be a trap of feeling like we don't have more work to do, or that we don't have more progress to make. And so, like, as I'm hearing the sentiments from folks, it's these really amazing people, right? The individual acts of people who are committed to anti-racism, to interrogating white supremacy, that is making a difference. And so for me, I just think about the ways that white supremacy is the foundation of our education system. Who was it created for, and how far have we come since the origin? I remember the Dartmouth report of, I think, 1860 talked about the mission of Dartmouth University was the forced assimilation of indigenous peoples to Western European values, culture, and Christianity. And so if that is at the foundation of our higher education system, then what are the ways that we have deviated from that? What are the ways that this system has been upheld? And so I think that while it's great to acknowledge the progress, and also I know that President Bitterbaum, you're on this call as well. I have not seen a college president as committed to making sure that you're naming all of those systems that are at play. So I want to commend you for that. And we can't fall into the trap of the fact that there are policies and practices at play that are disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous students of color, Black, Indigenous staff of color. Because Dominic, when I hear you say this is the first time that you could talk freely about race, that's white supremacy. Like, that sucks. That's terrible.
It is.
That we have to even be there. And so how can we dismantle these systems?
Well, but and again, I want everybody else to comment here, but see, we have to go back. When I started covering politics, this is before the times that we have now. Now they have Blacks. There used to be a joke that they only let Blacks do the sports or weather. You can be a clown or you can do sports, but you could never, ever do the white man's thinking game of politics. And so now you have, and I've conversated with a lot of them, and they make me feel the African Americans now that are on the MSNBCs and the CNNs, and they look at me like an elder statesman, and I sort of still feel like that 18-year-old kid in Cortland. But you know, I was in politics, but there were no Blacks in politics, and so I was not allowed to talk freely about it. Period. Because it was viewed that if the Black guy covering politics talked about race, then it would be a lightning rod for criticism and it would not be good. So to engage in this conversation, and all you have to do is check the record. I've never done anything like this before in my career.
Yeah.
And so that's why when I heard from Flossie Lomax, I jumped at the opportunity because it's exciting. And we have to call a spade about the problems that exist for all Americans, but in particular for people of color.
Yeah. Just add on to what Rachel said, and Dominic, you know, this is why I believe African American studies programs, Black studies programs are just so critical and important. I had opportunity to major in secondary social studies and African American studies. Then I went on to Cornell and majored in Africana studies, and it provided in me with a certain consciousness when I entered the real world. So I tell my students at every graduation, as you go into the professions, if you don't go in with a certain consciousness, because of race and racism, you can do damage if you don't have the wherewithal, the knowledge, the skill set to not only navigate the world that you're in, but to go in as somebody who resists, as a disruptor, someone who can challenge the status quo. And it's dangerous, right? Because you're talking about your own life and your family's life. But these programs, like Black studies programs across the nation, are critical. When you're a doctor, you should take courses in Black studies, so you can be a doctor who can go into communities and support and lift the communities, instead of a doctor who goes into the community and take advantage of the communities, right? So these programs saved my life and allowed me to go into teaching at 26 years old, and as a principal at 34 years old, with a certain consciousness to go into the toughest communities. I work in when some say the poorest high school in the state of Georgia. About a mile away from my high school is a state prison, and my students live next door in dilapidated housing projects next to that prison. So my students literally see a prison on the way to school and on the way home each and every day. And this is real life. So colleges have an opportunity to really ingrain a certain consciousness in kids, especially a school that's largely an educational institution like SUNY Cortland. We can produce people who can go out into the real world and disrupt instead of just accept the status quo.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Yusuf. More recently, our Intro to Black Studies classes, believe me, 90% of the students in those classes are white students who now want to learn about the history that they were never taught. Because I'm using authors like Ranga, Ali Mazrui, Molefi Asante, those who believe in the field. And now our students are reading different things from the lies that have been fed to them for so long. Change will come, but we have to face it. That race is always that elephant in that room. And if we say we don't see race, we are lying to ourselves. Some 10, 15 years ago, teachers were told not to see race. And they say, I don't see color. And that hurts that black kid in that classroom when a teacher say, I don't see you. You are so invisible. And that's all a lie. We can see the perception from where the teacher is coming from, but it's begin from facing the truth. And the truth is the way to begin. Epistemology, the truth in knowledge. How do we see knowledge itself? It's so very, very important to our students. And we have to make sure that is happening.
I would like to bring up the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now, and that issue happens to be President Trump. And I'm torn, hear me out now, I'm torn because the Donald Trump of today has been quite destructive and polarizing and has played a major role in race relations going down. But the Donald Trump, I'm just in a weird world, folks. I'm in a very weird world because I knew Trump personally before he ran, right? And we had a personal relationship. And he did a book before he ran, Think Like a Champion, in which he started the book. I'm not saying it's bragging. I'm saying it's because it's the reality. He started the book praising me, right? And in later chapters, it was updated and then he took me out. But so the Donald Trump that I knew privately, he was an okay guy. I never saw anything racial. But then as he became a candidate, he was playing to that base for that vote. And that meant that he had to do racial things, awful things. And so when somebody asked the question, how do we unite? Well, one way we unite, and again, I like him on a personal level. And when I see him, I'm going to let him know that I think he screwed up. But how we unite is, one, President Trump had to go. And if Biden does nothing else, and trust me, folks, generally, I won't even reveal my party affiliation. Generally, I don't talk as a Democrat or as a Republican. But if Biden does anything else, as long as he lowers the temperature in terms of what's going on, because Trump sent a signal that we people of color are inferior and that we don't have equal rights. So one way how we unite the country is President Trump had to go. The next way, and then I'll let others respond, is that we've got to finally get to a day of equal treatment for all. And anyone that says that there's equal treatment today, yeah, America elected Obama. Yes, Oprah Winfrey's a billionaire. But I'm talking about everyday people of color, everyday folks. And we don't get the same treatment. So we've got to get to the stage and to the day of equal treatment for all. And that's how you unite the country.
And Dominic, I think I struggle with that because under a capitalist system, in order to get equal treatment, you may have to take food out of the mouths of white people, right? If we're thinking about just privilege, right? To live in the community you want, to have the best supermarket, to have the best that country can offer, you will have to take food out and you have to redistribute if you're going to be fair. And I don't know if folks are willing to do that. I don't know if the folks, we saw in the news a couple of years ago, famous people who cheated to get their kids into college, right? That's a prime example. They were able to pay for their kids and lie on the application while other students are struggling to even get into college. So there's such the wealth gap is so wide, it's widening every year that I really wonder if it's truly possible to get to that space.
I absolutely agree with you, Yosef. I'm a little bit troubled by that because what Trump did, even though he was a nice guy back then, I personally don't know him. There's something there that bubbled up. His starting to say all these things and encouraging all of this inhumane treatment allowed people who felt that way to bubble up and cause all this dismay. So to me, I think you're right. Biden has lowered the temperature, but guess what? All that stuff's still under here, and I'm trying to figure out how do we get there? How do we get to those people? One of my concerns has always been if we've been slaves and we've always been considered property. And I think that feeling, even though I think that's an elephant in the room, that we as people have always been considered property, but not human beings. And I think if we can get to that level of considering all of us are human beings, and equity meaning some of us need a little bit more than others, regardless of color, we might be able to have a dialogue, start that conversation.
Yes. Yusuf mentioned it well. Let me let you go. Rachel, yes, you have it, and I will chime in later on. Go ahead, Rachel.
Are you sure? All right. So I think one of the things that like keeps getting convoluted is the fact that being nice is not the same as being anti-racist. Like, we can be nice people, we could be moral people, we could be good people, and we could still perpetuate all of those systems. And so one of the things that I put in the chat, specifically as a white person that looks at critical whiteness, that looks at the ways that whiteness is synonymous with racism, is the ways that we have suppressed our racist attitudes and behaviors and pushed them down, but they still come out. We just convince ourselves that we are not acting in racist ways. And we can actually convince ourselves that being not racist exists, and it's just not true. And so when we're talking about, like, especially the economic gap in our country, I think about and go back in history to Bacon's Rebellion. I go back to 1705 when affirmative action actually began, and that was to advantage people who looked like me. And so at Bacon's Rebellion, you know, folks came together across cross-class lines and across racial lines to rebel against General William Berkeley. And in that moment, there was this community collective power to dismantle some of these systems. And that felt threatening. And so we responded with more white supremacy, and we created what was known as the chattel slave. And then we also created what was called the indentured servant. And people who looked like me at the end of our servitude got 120 acres of land. And I'm just thinking about how that's like 400 years of monopoly that I have been able to play, whether I individually benefit from it or not, whether that generational wealth came specifically to my bank account. I think about the ways that if we're talking about equity and racial equity and class equity, we have to acknowledge that there's a 400-year head start that has been supported by policies, by institutions, and that they are consistently creating new policies to keep these things in place and justifying it under the guise of unity. And so I just think about how can we dismantle these systems. We first have to be aware and intentional about naming them. And when I say we, I'm talking about white people. I know that I'm trying not to center whiteness, especially in this conversation. And whiteness is centered in so many ways that are not productive. So how do we center it in a way to decenter it? Is kind of what comes up for me.
Yes, Yusuf mentioned, thank you very much, Rachel. And Yusuf mentioned how difficult it is to look at the point of equity to make sure that we in America are going to see equity as it's supposed to be. Equitable distribution of wealth, resources. Racial justice perhaps is a little bit more attainable. But as Yusuf mentioned, I started by saying the founding fathers have got this complex idea of creating a nation. coming to loot the land from the red people, Native American, forcing the black people to come into America, and then beginning to deal with the concept of democracy. And if you look at these concepts in the preamble of the Constitution, the ideals that hold America all will go against equity. Individualism, one of the ideals. If you have individualism, it is about you, your wife, your picket fence, your cat, and your dog. That's about it. Individualism goes against group ideas such as race, such as gender, such as class. And if you have studied these things carefully, you see how complex America is. One is individualism. The second is capitalism. Capitalism that is based on profit maximization is not going to look at redistribution of wealth. But wealth has been created for 400 years to one America, and the other America is chasing wealth. So you are not going to get to an equilibrium where one group is equal to the other. Meritocracy is another thing that disregards all racial elements. Say in a merit system, you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps and your brilliancy and nothingness, not your race, not your gender. And so if you look at all these things that are part of the pillars that hold America, it is so difficult to think about equity, but hopefully we're looking at the end of the tunnel sometime. There will be racial justice, and we should always continue advocating for racial justice.
Thanks, Seth. I wanted to share with folks, feel free to put questions in chat. I know I've written it there a couple of times, so I want to make sure anybody who can't see it knows that they can add stuff. I've been texting Rachel if she jumps in a bit because she offered to share anything from chat. One of the questions someone has is, any of the panelists read the book on reparations called From Here to Equality? And what are your thoughts on reparations?
The question on reparation is a question that has emerged over and over again. The United States Congress is not ready to tackle reparation. It has come about, it has been dismissed. How would you apportion? At this point, we should not be talking about money in reparation. There should be other forms of doing it. But I always go back and say the Germans were able to do it. Okay, there have to be private-public partnership in this question of reparation. What I call PPPRR, private-public partnership in race relations. If we can get that happen, companies that have benefited from slave labor, from when black people came to America and rebuild this country, can begin reasoning. In Germany, the government, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, all these companies got together and said, we will have to do something to what we did to the Jewish people. We have done something to Japanese interns. But what about the black story? It's almost a non-issue. I remember some 10 years ago as a scholar, that was our thing, talking about reparation. But then it gets to Congress and it's always quickly dismissed. The question is, how are you going to do it? What will be the formula? How can you tackle reparation? But always, I say, without recognition, there will be no reconciliation. Without reconciliation, there will be no reparations. So we have a difficult task here when it comes to reparation.
I'll try and tackle it for a second here. I interviewed a Columbia University professor, a renowned professor on race relations, about 6 months ago, and she wrote a book on reparations. And her idea, and it's one that I think I can support, her idea of dealing with it would be it centers around land. She says it's never going to fly. I wish I had a name off the top of my head. It's never going to fly with just straight money. But she believes that there should be community trusts set up around the country in which there's land and home ownership. Home ownership. That was something that I did not understand, that you can go from poverty to, I'm not going to say wealth, but you know, you can have something. And so she believes that real estate is the way. I wish, I'll get her name in a second and mention it. Her book is all about this, and I could support that. I think if we ever think that people of color are going to get straight out reparations, politically, that's just not going to fly. I mean, I wish I could tell you something different, but I'm here to be honest with you. And politicians don't have the stomach for it. They don't have the will for it. They don't feel they can sell it to their constituents. It's never going to go down that way. But in terms of real estate, you know, where you can get into a home and 40 years later or whatever the time, you could sell that home and you could walk away with $100,000-$200,000, whatever the figure may be. That's a way that many of us have got to, that's a way towards reparation. So, but I just want to say this about EOP, because I believe this with all my heart. I really do. One way we can make things better is through programs like EOP. EOP, the Educational Opportunity Program, needs to tout its own horn as far as the Speaker of the Assembly of the great state of New York is an EOP graduate. A congressman from Brooklyn, his name escapes me right now, but very prominent congressman, went to Binghamton. He's in line to become speaker after Pelosi. Through programs like Cortland, and I'm being honest, I was going to be good in life at something, either something productive or something non-productive. And many of the kids in my neighborhood, certainly the black men, the jail cells were waiting for us. They're still waiting for us in terms of the upbringing. So to be blunt and direct, I was going to do something productive and be a taxpayer, in which I've paid a lot of money in taxes for the education I got at Cortland, or I was going to do something illegal, and that wouldn't have been good. So through programs like EOP, I really feel that it's a start, because when you start talking about making things equal, it's such a, and I agree with the professor, Rachel, in terms of she's dead on all of her points, but those topics are so large, I just don't know how we get there. EOP takes kids with no promise like myself, and you can become something. And it's happened over and over and over again. And so that's my answer on reparations. But I also had to praise the Educational Opportunity Program, because without that program and without Tom Newkirk, who's no longer with us, Newkirk with his bald head, you know, we came into the program, him, Dale Carter, look to your left, look to your right. One of you won't be here in 6 months. Scared the shit out of me. Scared, you know what I'm trying to say. Excuse me. It scared the hell out of me. And that alone scared me straight to do good. Yvette can tell you the stories, Yvette Parrish, to do good in school. And so may Tom Newkirk rest in peace as well.
Another question came into the chat, but I wanted to see if panelists had other responses to the previous question. I'm not trying to shift if people aren't ready.
I'll just say quickly, reparations, it's complex. If we do not own institutions, if we do not have an economic base, if we get a check, what happens next, right? So I'm more concerned with developing institutions. You know, so we can have an economy. I don't want anyone to write me a check and then I spend this money on, on the mainstream, and I have nothing left. Something that's long-standing and can last beyond my generation, I think is more important. And I think that exists within institutions and programs like EOP, which saved my life as well.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to say about teaching what to do with money, so that I will have it and be able to use it further on and actually multiply it.
The thing is, money and programs, again, without reconciliation, we got to get that race factor out of there. Without recognition and reconciliation, you can do what happened in South Africa. The white supremacists have left, but they took the money with them. Now the black majority of them are suffering. And much of the situation is not changed. And so you have to look at a program that is highly sustainable. And how do you do it? Again, think about generations and the future. It could be schools. It could be what the Germans did. And I believe they did it well. But that is the only best example that we can find in the world. How they were able to pay for their sins against Jews and so
on. Good example, Dr. Seth. Very good example.
All right. Our next question was from someone in the chat. How do you respond to efforts in predominantly red states to make it harder for people to vote, like through absentee ballots or something?
So I live in a red state. I live in Georgia, and it's interesting because I may have a different take, and it may be controversial. There are many groups, ethnic groups in red states who are building institutions. I often look into some Asian groups who go into Black communities and they build supermarkets, right? I don't know if their priority is voting. And I talk about that a lot with my girlfriend because we see that there's an onslaught of campaigns and commercials that urge people to vote. When I look at the prison system in the state of Georgia, in states like Louisiana and this country, it's still disproportionately poor Black and Latino men. Right? So I'm not necessarily convinced, even as a 9-year high school principal veteran, that the intent is really around supporting people to grow, to maintain an economic standard. I think a lot of it is about power play. And I'm not totally convinced that voting is the answer in this country as it exists today. I'm just not there. But I know that in local elections are really powerful, and that there's some changes that's even been made at the national level. But at the same time, the economic gap is still widening, and we still have the same issues. So I'm interested in another way to make progress for people, and something that I'm interested in exploring. I'm not the vote or die person. That's not me.
I can relate to that. I think, Yusuf, you and I share similar viewpoints. I struggle with our only savior being the democracy that created the same system that we're trying to fight against. So I'm there with you on that. And at the same time, I'm like, how do you fight within a structure that already exists? And for me, that means maybe voting so that we can have some shift, because we're not going to change otherwise. So I'm stuck in this like both and of this democracy was set up to uphold white supremacy. We see that in our Declaration of Independence. We see that in our Constitution. We see that in every single law, every single policy that was created, none of which specifically did anything to advantage Black, Indigenous folks of color. And so there's this disconnect. And at the same time, I think voter turnout and having folks specifically in red states think about the ways that this is a humanity issue. And I don't know that everybody sees it as a humanity issue, especially for people who look like me. And that sucks to say. And that's not where I am. That's not how I feel. And if we're looking at who we're voting for, are we voting selfishly to advantage the things that we already have, or are we voting to actually create equity? And I don't know that the purpose of our democracy or democratic system has ever been to create equity. And so, Yusuf, I'm in that confusion. I'm in that place. Like,
yeah. I don't want to vote for somebody who's going to spend $1 million on war versus somebody who spends $1.5 million on war. We still have war presidents, you know, and the fact that we don't have viable candidates outside of the two major systems scares me. You know, in 2021, that we don't have a real viable candidate who's not backed by corporations to really reflect the needs and wants of the people and not the wealthy.
I hear you too. But are you saying that we should be training and developing our own people? And I'm not even looking at color. People who understand us and get them in the government to make these changes that we're talking about.
Yes, as a political scientist, I know that political participation is very so important. But we have to look at both mobilized participation and autonomous participation. Are people voting freely because they really, really want to elect somebody that will represent them? A number of times I've projected in my writing what I call relational democracy and not representative democracy, because for Black folks, it's so very, very difficult. What is the representation all about? And so relational democracy, someone who is going to be there, who relates to you, who will represent your interests, and not for mega America, corporate America interests. But guess what? They get their money from big corporate America. And so, yes, democracy, and this year we saw how fragile democracy is. We thought the elections is going to be a blowout. No. With all the craziness that happened, I say it was still very, very close. Where we are looking at 4 states to decide who leads America. It should not be. With all the wrong things that happen in America, it still come to the tape that is about 4 states. So democracy is fragile. It is not what the founding fathers thought is going to be. They taught us in Federalist number 10 that there will be competition. But then they said the competition is going to be over economics. And we are seeing that still. What does that do to race, to gender, and other places? Democracy, I think, will not quite save the issue of race. We have to go beyond that. And if it is, it's what I proposed some years ago, a relational form of democracy and not representative government.
all right, so we have a few more questions that have come in. How are panelists feeling about shifting into those questions?
Let's do it.
Let's do it, yep.
Awesome. Okay, so race is a loaded term. saddled with long-standing misconceptions about the roots of biological variation. Kids know that variation is ubiquitous, the rule, not the exception. Why are we not addressing this variation in classrooms, at least in middle school, or to explore the reality and misconceptions that underline the public's view of racial identities and group differences?
So just to be clear, Rachel, are we saying why we're not talking about race as sort of a biological term as opposed to a system and institutional structure? I don't know if I understand the question.
That's what I'm thinking. The person, if you are on and you ask that question, could you unmute yourself and clarify what you're asking?
I think you are muted. You go to unmute, please.
Okay, can you hear me now?
You had to wait for me, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm asking. Why are we not in classrooms, beginning at least at the middle school level, talking about the biological meaning of race, what it does and does not mean, what it can and cannot convey, what the data support with respect to our understanding of group differences?
Yeah.
Why are we not addressing that in classrooms?
I mean, I can, Dr. Zuma?
Okay. First, we have to define what we mean by race. Okay. And some 200 years ago, many people thought that race was a biological fact. Race is not a biological fact.
No, I understand that. What I'm asking is why are we not having these conversations with kids? What you all have been talking about are deeply systemic problems, some of which result from a widespread misunderstanding of what race is and what it is not, and what biology can and cannot say about race. I understand the history of our understanding or lack thereof about what race is. My question is an educational one. Why are we not having these conversations with kids in classrooms?
Sure, and I'm happy to chime in. Or actually, you trying to chime in?
I just want to quickly say, I don't think we're having conversations about racism in classrooms. I don't think we're having conversations about power structures, about race as power plus privilege in institutions and systemic racism. I don't think we're having that conversation at all. I remember learning that race did not really exist, that biologically did not exist. But I don't think we're having enough conversations about Black history, about Native American history, about a whole host of things in classrooms. And I think that's purposeful. I think that's to create a group that obeys instead of, as opposed to critically think about the world going on around them.
I definitely echo those sentiments, Yusuf. And I think about the cyclical nature of racism, right? So you have an education system that is founded in whiteness. And I know Joe asked exactly what is whiteness. So I'll answer that and then swerve into my question is, whiteness is a system of dominant ideologies that sets the scope of how anybody can be, do, and act in any given space. And so it is a system of dominance that allows the system of racism to exist. It is a normalized expectation of how we assume people should show up in a space. And if you don't conform to that, then you're not deemed successful. And so if that is the root of our education system and we're not preparing our educators to go in and our educators don't necessarily know the difference because that's not necessarily taught in the K-12 system. So it's so cyclical because you can only teach what you have once learned and what you have once experienced. And one of the consequences, I'm not saying that integration was wrong, but one of the consequences of desegregation of public schools is the ways that we lost really amazing Black teachers and Black support systems because folks were forced to conform into the system of whiteness. And so we lost a vast amount of history, a vast amount of power, to engage in these conversations in a way that allows people to accept their race. And race is a social construct. We have 99% of us share the same DNA. And there's practical implications and consequences based on how we have been racialized in the United States. And so it's a very complex thing to answer for me. I don't know if other panelists have anything that they might want to share with that.
Yeah, it's all based on curriculum building. And as you mentioned, Rachel, there is the what you call interlocking system of oppression. Part of it is the educational system. People who are power, who want to see how things go, who have kept the system that way. It is interesting that we have yourself here. I remember when he was student teaching one day, he introduced some of the things that he learned in college. And the principal at that time, I don't know, Yusuf, if you remember that, you came to my office almost with tears in your eyes that this is what I wanted to teach. He told me I can't do that. And I remember that very, very clearly. So it is power holders, those who maintain the structures of the curriculum, are those who are not allowing us to do the right thing.
I remember going into teaching, I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to, really teach what I thought was important for our students. And luckily enough, I was able to go into a school right after graduate school that was very Afrocentric, that supported, this is the curriculum, but this is what our students need to know. So we celebrated Fred Hampton, we celebrated, Frederick Douglass, we celebrated Fannie Lou Hamer. We were able to go through the curriculum at the same time. I had the flexibility to really enlighten and inspire students, but that was because I had a principal who was open-minded and supported that kind of work. So unfortunately, it's school by school. We can't.
Joseph, I see that you want to share. Thank you for your question. We're just making sure to center the voices of those on the panel. So if you want to chime in on the chat, we are happy to hear your comments and what you have to share with the group.
Yeah, for just not to spoil your evening, but a colleague told me that curriculum development is like moving a graveyard without disturbing the dead. And so this is how difficult it is to develop a curriculum. And once it is made, we need a new generation of educators who will say we have to start talking about race in K through 6. Other than that, it's not going to happen. In the college, we're already doing it, but not at the elementary and secondary level.
And I'd add, Dr. Zuma, we talk about race in the biological component. I'm afraid to say it may not matter. Like a white person cannot walk down the street and harm me or compromise my life chances. But a system in which white supremacist forces, controls, for example, the prison, the judicial system, education system, the food systems. I mean, these are systems and organizations that control the life chances of a group of people. So that conversation to me is more important than the biology factor, even though we know that there was a lot of sort of misconceptions about Black versus white and superiority and things like that years ago. Right now, I'm more concerned with when I close my eyes and I think of positions of power, they all look white and mad. And they all can influence an entire population's life chances. That's, I think, is the problem.
I think you have a very, very strong point. What we do is we always explain the social issues into the biology and give the inequity and inability to do things is always justified sometimes through the biology. But the biology is not true. It is more of the systems and the social structures. We say race, it's a concept that signifies and symbolizes socioeconomic and political constraint and interest by making references to different phenotypes. So the phenotype part is just a little. The rest of it is all about systems and construct and conflict. And that is what holds race. So the biology is really nothing. We use it in supporting what the white supremacists would say long ago, that certain people are black, therefore they are inferior. And it's based on biology. And that was debunked very, very long ago.
So there was another question, and this is kind of going back to when we were talking about the government and reparations. It's, should Black people continue waiting and hoping for the government to right the wrongs through reparations, or should Black people pull together collectively and begin to set up their structures and systems for themselves? If the latter, what is the best way to begin?
You know, that people didn't get here on their own, right? The GI Bill supported tons of people coming home from World War II to set them up for future success. And I think that goes back to a statement or a question that was made earlier in the session around morality, right? Around the idea that Black people are more violent, right, or more criminal, but there's no conversation about drugs being pumped into the community or guns being left in the community. I mean, it's larger than just a behavior, right? So in one instance, yes, I do believe that economic empowerment is important. That, but there's no base, right? So for other groups of people who have a language and who have a home, when you kind of transpose that to African Americans, where's the language? Where's the home? Where's the collective identity, right? I have hope, and I believe that there's a certain consciousness among a collective group of Black people in this country to do that work. But at the same time, other groups have progressed with public policy. And I don't think there's a reason why that should be ignored for one group and supported for another group. I mean, corporate welfare is a real thing, right? But it's a problem when it comes to marginalized peoples.
I think there have been a long time on this proposition of self-help, and you can look at organizations. If you want to go back to Louis Farrakhan and even Malcolm X and other people who preach about self-help, the idea have been there, but as Mr. Muhammad mentioned, no group in America did everything on their own. And Joe Fagan talks about what I call the white racial frame, which start with stereotypes that become the narrative becomes policy, policy becomes program. For Black America and BIPOC populations, when it begins from the stereotypes, we talk about your inability not to be self-sustained. But on the other hand, there's always white America, even though they may be accepting corporate handouts or hand-me-downs, it's never brought into the narrative. So we have to begin from acknowledging the fact that no group has got to this level. It took white America 400 years, generation over generation, to build that wealth over the back of Black Americans. Free slave labors, plantation agriculture. When we are industrializing, it was Black Americans. Black America was building the White House. And when they built Wall Street, it was burned down. So these things have to put into perspective that as Americans, we need help, and we also need to help ourselves. But it cannot just be self-help for a certain group. It is taking too long, and we ask the question, how long is too long? How long is too long to realize that we all have to accept the fact that we need help from both government and also the community. And I agree exactly with what you said, mentioned.
I agree, and I feel like it's complex, right? Like there's three different types of racism. It's individual superiority, it's cultural racism, and then it's institutional laws and policies. And when those three things have combined to create this system, it's so hard to dismantle it because it's working the way that it's supposed to work. It's how it's intended. So when we talk about the system being broken, I have to highly disagree because it's not broken. It's working exactly how it was meant to work. And the other piece for me, and this, I know this is going to be controversial, and I'm totally okay with that. I want y'all to hear me out. Is that although very different, the consequences are very different. The impact is very different. But white people also are impacted negatively by this system. And we have to realize that. The rigidity that we feel, the ways that we need dominance in our lives, the ways that we can't have authentic relationships, specifically with Black, Indigenous people of color, the ways that we can't engage in conversations about race because all of a sudden we don't think we're moral anymore. This dissonance between am I good, am I bad? Those are all of the ways that we are also harmed by the system of racism and by the system of whiteness. And so we have to also realize that we perpetuate a system that doesn't benefit us. Although it benefits us economically, it benefits us in ways that are different from specifically Black, Indigenous folks of color. But what would it mean for us to realize that this system is terrible for everybody? And that there is a way for us to dismantle and to live more authentically and more in alignment with making sure that we are being the best people that we can be, but we're dismantling this sense of internal dominance that I grew up with. I think about white supremacy culture, specifically the article by Tima Okun and the late Kenneth Jones that was written in 2001. That looks at these characteristics of organizations such as perfectionism, either or thinking, worship of the written word, defensiveness, paternalism, quantity over quality, and the ways that we are all impacted by that system. And so does creating a new system without dismantling the original one, where will that get us? I'm not sure, but I do know that it takes people who look like me to be committed to the liberation of everybody. And so if we cannot see ourselves directly connected to the liberation of Black, Indigenous folks of color, we are not doing our part. And so how can we team up together and dismantle the power that we have created?
And Rachel, you said it well. We said liberation can never be attained until both the oppressor and the oppressed are liberated. And sometimes we don't see the picture that way. It's not just about the freedom of those that are oppressed. The oppressor that is doing the oppression is also suffering, but sometimes he or she doesn't even know. Both sides have to be liberated for us to reach that point of liberation.
You know, everything that I'm listening, and Chair, I and also Rachel, I agree in theory with what you're saying, but in the world that I'm from, of high-profile policymakers, this is never going to happen. I hate to be pessimistic, but you're not going to get the dramatic change in terms of curriculum to make things fair. We can't even get equal dollars spent on our kids. And Rachel, the only thing that you said that white people are also hurt by, what was your term that you used again? The term that you used?
We are also impacted by the cost of racism.
Okay, but ask a black person which role we'd rather be in. I mean, and I know you get it, Rachel, because you're saying it, but you know, I think about what happened in Rochester recently. I think the young lady was 8 years old, and she was distressed, and the police responded. And Rochester has a black woman as mayor. They maced this 8-year-old black girl because they tried to put her into the vehicle. She said, "I'm not going without my father." And 8 police officers on location, and they maced a handcuffed 8-year-old black young lady that maybe weighed $1.05. And so everything that you folks are saying, I respect and I agree with you, but that's not the world that we live in. And the truth is, this is not going to change in any of our lifetimes. We can talk this talk, but the reality is the reality. Look at what happened in Rochester. An 8-year-old black girl handcuffed, not a single black officer surrounding her. And all she only had to do, it was a female officer, and the female officer maced her in her face, and they took her to a psychiatric institution. So how are we going to talk about a system of fairness when stuff like that is happening? Do you honestly think that that would happen to an 8-year-old white girl? Of course not, because she's seen as a human being. Look at what happened, folks. This is my reality. Look at what happened in St. Louis. What's the young man that was killed by the police officer? The officer ultimately was cleared.
Mike Brown?
What's the name again?
The Brown?
Yes. Look at what happened to that young man. Look at what happens in cities across America. If not for these cell phones, you talked about change. This is how we're getting change. Because the police report in my world is always consistently different than what it could be 10 African American witnesses. That doesn't matter. What matters is what the police department says. Oh, I thought when he was reaching for his wallet, I thought he was reaching for a gun. I felt threatened. I felt that my life was in danger. Folks, this is the reality. And this is what we have to deal with right now. What you're talking about is great in theory, but unfortunately, I just don't see it happening. Maybe you can prove me wrong and tell me different, but I just don't see it happening. And Yusef, you're on the front line dealing with kids in schools every day.
Yep.
And so you see all of this playing out.
And what I see, is people who come from poverty and may move up to the middle class may create this perception that there's equal opportunity. And without a certain consciousness, without a certain education, could sometimes do more damage and more harm. Like the female officer macing a young black girl, right? It feels like a game sometimes where the superordinate class kind of just pulls people up, like me, right? Through EOP, through poverty into the middle class, that create this idea that if I do it, everybody can do it. But there may be a space where I'm purposely in this upper middle class space to create this idea that is equal opportunity while the poor gets poorer and the rich gets richer. So if you don't come with a certain mindset of liberation, of disruption, right? Of challenging the status quo. And for me, education is a powerful tool because I have an opportunity. I've led 3 high schools over the last 9 years, and I've had an opportunity to engage and to expose students and to really, like, I have a book in my office right now on lynchings, and I bring my students in my office and we go through the pictures of Black men and women being lynched in the 20th century, and some of my students say, this is not real, this did not happen. They have no idea, right? So education provides, I think, a space to disrupt. And if we don't have a disruption mindset, we continue the status quo and we don't make things better.
Like everybody, I have been listening. I come from having marched, stoned, dogs water. I'm blessed to be alive. Many of my friends are dead, and on whose back I'm trying to stand. And I'm happy to hear all of these wonderful things, but my question still is, how do we get out of this quagmire? I'm hearing us identify a lot of things. I think education, as you said, Dominic, we have to do that. But it's not going to change in our lifetime. But what kind of tiny little bit of advice can we give to our audience? For instance, I'll share something. I know all of you are very academic, and I can be that way too. But when I talk to my students, like you, Yusuf, I talk, reality. And I live in a very nice neighborhood here at SUNY Cortland. But at one time, I had dog excrement placed in my driveway. Now I have a 1/4 mile driveway. I've been in my place for over 20 years. Now that didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. It happened quite a bit. To me, that said, you don't belong here. You absolutely, and I've been here 20 years. And I shared it with a group of very religious, wonderful white people. And they all said to me, oh, you are overreacting. It was probably just, do you know what dog excrement looks like? It's probably a deer. I didn't say anything at the time, but then I went back to them and I blasted them. You didn't hear me. You're not listening to me. How do we get people to hear me? They were so shocked that we now talk about everything and they're getting a little bit wiser, but I guess I'm saying somewhere, a conversation, somewhere, a start. What can we say?
What my experience has taught me, and I'm not saying that this is right, but from my experience of close to 40 years in journalism, of covering communities, at least witnessing Black communities across America from the '88 campaign with Jesse Jackson. And it was one of the things that broke my heart. So I'm 3 years removed from Cortland, and I'm traveling all over the country and the world. And every Black community we went into looked the same. It was impoverished. It was often on the side of the railroad tracks. Our people, at least where Reverend Jackson went campaigning, were not doing well. And so I say all of that to say that my answer is I really believe that, yes, as the chair and Rachel said earlier, we do, and also you, Regina, and Yusuf, we do need help. And we need help the same way everybody else has received help. But I really believe the only way we're going to change this is that we have each collectively have got to, I'm not going to say be responsible for our families, but we have collectively, because I decided on day one when I arrived in Cortland that I was never going back to the projects, ever. And it was sink or swim. And that's the only way I see, and around all the successful people that I've been around, and it has been a lot, they do the same thing in terms of, we have got to, I mean, if we're going to be honest, unfortunately, from slavery on, in some quarters in our communities, education is not important. I'm sorry. We have to be honest about this. And we have got to, all of these large philosophical questions and ideas, they're great. But the reality is, right, something that breaks my heart, my son, when he's stocky like me, and we used to have to argue with him to go to the bathroom before we left the house. Why? Because in mid-Manhattan, a Black male asking, can he use the restroom at a restaurant, they're going to tell you, no, it's out of service. It's a million excuses. And this is my reality of having the conversation with my son of, don't jump with a police officer. Don't do it, son. This is the reality of the world. Don't be respectful. I will fight your battles. You do everything that officer asked for the most part. You don't sign written statements, but you do everything that officer. So that is the reality of Black America and minority America today.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got to, in my humble answer, we have got to each collectively decide that we're going to turn this around for each family.
Yes, I like to add the broader picture as someone who studies race, and I've written many books about race and articles. This thing called blackness is troubling. And as Eric Dyson said, there's always a loss for blackness. And this loss includes the wanting to control that blackness, to get inside it, and also to tame blackness. I thank God, I think I've been very successful. I'm a distinguished teaching professor. I've done everything correctly, but when I leave here and got in my car, I have to look in my rear view mirror all the time. When I get to my home, I am worried whether I'm doing the right thing. Somebody calling a place on me that I'm breaking and entering. You all know a Harvard professor, you know, in his own home during the Obama administration, was arrested for going into its own home.
Yeah.
You got to think about this thing called blackness. And this is what a brother who wrote a book called, What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker, said that living white black is an extreme sport. And it sure is. Living white black is an extreme sport. You got to know how to maneuver all the time. And that is the reality that we associate to being black, the concept of blackness, and how we interrogate whiteness. It is true. Today we are talking, and we have to put that on the table. What is blackness and what is whiteness? And that is what creates the two America, and that is what creates the colony and the nation.
You know, I appreciate all of the reflections, and also think about the ways that, like, even within this conversation, we're operating very much from a black-white binary, and that's part of the cost of racism too. Like, who are we erasing in these conversations? The experiences, particularly of multiracial folks, Latinx folks, folks of a variety of different ethnicities that don't fall in that black-white binary. And so just thinking about that and being reflective on that. And as Dominic, I totally hear you. The reality and the theory don't always align with each other. But I do have like a last question that might be theoretical, might be realistic. I'm not sure. But what does racial equity look like, and how will we know when we have it?
Racial equity looks like, and this doesn't happen all the time, okay? Racial equity looks like, if I get into an elevator with a white woman and she hasn't recognized me from television in the past or recognized my voice, she may clutch her purse. And I've actually done this before. I'm not proud of it. But when it's happened, I've said, Miss, Miss, you don't have anything that I want. So that's one way that racial equity looks like, where I have the same rights as my white colleagues, that I don't have to be twice as good as my white colleagues, that I'm not told in graduate school that I don't talk white so I can't be a newscaster. So that if I want to go get that $750,000 loan, I don't have to jump through hoops to get it. I want to be treated just like the white guy. Like the chair said with the 35,000, where he had to have someone white purchase the land for him. That's real for us. And so we want to be able to purchase the property and not to have someone white that's of a good nature do it for you. We want to get racial equity is when our schools are just as good as your schools in Scarsdale, and the politicians are treating our communities just as good as yours. Racial equity is when the police and the local communities respect Black people rather than looking at them as lower than dogs and killing them. Look at Eric Garner in Staten Island, the one that was choked to death. The police officers were cleared. And I don't want, I'm gonna wrap up in 1 second so others can speak. But Eric Garner, the police confronted him over selling loose cigarettes. And he said, I am not going to deal with this today. Now, apparently he had been arrested numerous times. The fatal mistake he made, a Black man, no citizen has the right to resist arrest. But a Black man, you better believe it can be deadly if you resist arrest. And so look what happened because he said no. The officer jumped on his neck and literally choked life out of him. So racial equity is when I and people of color can be treated just like everybody else. No better, no worse, just equal. Equal. All right, stop all the wink wink where the white boys get all the special privileges and the brothers told to get to the back. And then they make you think you're crazy when you call them out on your racism as the professor said, where they literally was putting dog mess in her yard and told her she was overreacting. That's what we deal with in America as Black people. Someone posted, how do I know the story? I couldn't see the whole, out of Chicago. What was that? I didn't see what the full text was. It said something about Chicago. How do I just saw it pop across my screen, but I didn't see the full comment. Anyway, others can go on and answer the question, but that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like to me.
Yeah. The answer, thank you, Dominic. You said it well. And I'm adding to that, it's a simple answer. When you reach the point of racial equity, people of color should have everything that white people have. We want the same thing, nothing different, nothing more. Okay? So it's about a point of equilibrium, a point of fairness, a point of respect, a point where there is no infantilization. You know, a stupid person will tell Regina that he doesn't know the difference between a dog poop and a deer poop. What does he think as a child? As a department chair, when I'm talking to somebody and I am infantilized to a point, I laugh at it. I say, what do they think I am? So when we reach racial equity, the society should be just. We always talk about a just society, but we have not had it. We have not had it. Impartial treatment. So impartiality, just society, fairness, and we all want exactly what white people have now. When it comes to freedom and liberty, white brothers and sisters have already attained freedom. But people of color see freedom as an aspiration. We want to move before that so we can attain freedom, and it's not just an aspiration. And that is racial equity for me.
I co-sign. Oh, Yusuf, go ahead.
Oh, no, yeah, Rich. Sure. Okay. Well, so for me, it's a lot. I'm going to turn 44 next week. I know that's crazy, Dr. Kelly. Isn't that crazy, Dr. Kelly? I'll
Happy
just
birthday.
Thank you. And I have 4 daughters, aged 6, 8, 12, and 16, and I'm raising my 4 girls. So when I think of racial equity, I automatically think of the definition of normalcy being dominated by white male values. Because I think of my daughters as African American, Black young ladies, but they're also ladies, right? And so, how do I protect them? How do I get them to think about race, about sex, gender, and all those things that come into play? I worry about if the definitions of normalcy is dominated by one group of people, where will they fit in, right? And you see it in so many ways in the education world. It's the test to become a teacher, right? That test, when I took that test, I put on my white male cap and took that test. When I took that 9-hour test to become a principal in New York City, I put on my white male cap and I answered those questions as if I was a white male, because I know if I gave my answers, I would not pass that 9-hour test. So for me, is when I see that everyone's worldview respected. Of course, I agree with Dominic and Dr. Zuma. Of course, for me, it's the respect of our values, our norms. Hey, I don't feel comfortable taking the vaccine. And because we live in 2 Americas, some groups may think that's absolutely crazy. But I know the history of vaccines and diseases that were put into, Black people in this country. So my worldview is a little bit different. That's not respected in popular culture. So, of course, I'll go back to life chances, proportionate amount of people in prison. It should not be 60% of Black males in prison. We are only less than 12% of the population, right? When I see fairness and when I see our values and our norms respected and not subordinate to other groups, to me, that's racial equity, and it includes a whole lot.
And I guess you all have covered pretty much all of those areas. Definitely have the right to, as you said, be like white people. I want to go where I want, do what I want, be educated, be just like everybody else. I don't want a door slammed in my face telling me, "Oh, you Black, you always flunk out and you're not worth my time." And so, yes, I really don't have anything to add. Well covered.
For me, the only thing I would add is psychological and physical safety, where people can feel safe to walk outside their doors, safe to show up in authenticity, safe to show up in all of the ways that I have been able to throughout my entire life, without feeling threatened, without feeling minimized, without feeling erased, without feeling like they aren't represented in policies and practices, without feeling like their worth is reduced because of the presence of folks around them. And so for me, that's the only thing that I would add to the sentiments that have already been shared.
Can I add one more thing, Erin?
Oh,
I have a cousin who's listening, and he's big financial guru, and we talk about finance all the time. And there's so many things at 44 that I did not learn when I was 18. If I knew half of the things I know now around financial literacy, when my students learn about the stock market, they learn about business, they learn about capitalism, they're awakened, right? So in terms of just moving towards freedom and economic independence, I really do think that there needs to be an approach where we teach students the real world around finances and economic opportunities, and not have them wait until they're way too old, to learn those things. I just want to throw that out there. That's something that I think about a whole lot.
And just one quick final thought. I just want to say to Professor Sam Kelly, if he's still with us, thank you for what you've done throughout your career. I don't think Dr. Kelly knows that for many of us, my father was never in my life. So for many of us that did not have a male role model figure, and we're thrust from the projects of New York City to Cortland, New York, Dr. Kelly, as a strong, respectable, educated Black man, represented so many things. And he showed us foremost that that success as a Black person was possible if you did things right. And so I want to thank Dr. Sam Kelly for being such a tremendous role model in my life. I would not have made it in journalism without you. And to Jack Carr, Jack, don't take this the wrong way. Jack is probably the coolest white boy in America. You know, he was a great educator. And I just thank you, Jack, for all you did, man, for making us feel comfortable coming out of the projects to Cortland. And you made it clear that success was possible. I just wanted to say that. Thank you, folks.
And just to add with Dr. Kelly, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Kelly, for all you do for me personally. Dr. Kelly helped me buy my first car when I was a senior at Cortland because I got my student teaching assignment was in Newfield. I had nowhere to get there. And so Dr. Kelly helped me secure my first car. Then he took me on a hill and taught me how to drive a stick. I bought the car, I didn't know how to drive it. But Dr. Kelly taught me how to drive a stick, and he made sure he got his money back. He hosted me, he hosted my family. He even came down to Brooklyn for my wedding, for my late wife. And so I told my daughters just last week, when we drive up to the East Coast in May to visit family, we got to stop in Fayetteville to see Dr. Kelly. So that's happening, Dr. Kelly. You have to see the girls. I truly, truly appreciate all you've done.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Rachel. We appreciate giving you all your time, your knowledge, your experiences tonight so candidly. I know if I can speak for myself, I'm walking away from this conversation with a lot. So just appreciate you taking the time to share it with us all. So thank you for being so generous to Cortland. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of our SUNY Portland Alumni Association Board of Directors who made this all come to reality tonight. So thank you. I hope it's just the first of many conversations. I don't want to live in a place where Dominic is told not to talk about race. I think that's exactly what we need to talk about. So again, we appreciate your time and all of your knowledge, and thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who joined us tonight.